So I'm going to move straight into introductions to the first presentation. And that's called Pragmatic and Principled, the approach to content acquisition and collection development at the University of York Library. And we have Kirsty Lingstadt, Director of Library Archives and Learning Services at the University of York, and her colleague David Brown, Faculty Engagement Manager, also Library Archives and Learning Services at the University of York. Kirsty and David come from the University of York, where the library's been exploring a values-based approach to acquisitions. They're going to tell us about the catalyst for this approach, how it's developed so far, and consider some possible futures for library purchasing. So, over to you.
Thank you very much, Katrina, and good afternoon, everybody. The dying light of the conference is a hard time to present, especially after lunch, but don't worry because we're going to enliven you with the bold colours of the University of York brand template this afternoon. So, one of the things that really struck me this morning was something that Jane said in her introduction, was that this has been a conference about values. And obviously we're going to be building on that theme, but I would also reflect that it's been a bit of a conference about authenticity as well, and I hope that it's in that context that we'll bring some of the experiences that we've had about developing this values-based approach at the University of York. I will reintroduce us, and you may wonder why, because Katrina has just done that. It's in no way a shameless attempt to avoid answering any of the hard questions myself and making sure that those go directly to Kirsty. But it also gives me the opportunity to say that for the purposes of this presentation, I will be the principled one and Kirsty will be the pragmatic one, which I suspect is the lot in life of many a library director who will now be solemnly nodding around the room. Yes, we do have to be pragmatic. But we will demonstrate as we go along that they're not quite so divorced from one another as that might suggest. So in our presentation, we want to do three things. We want to tell you about our best intentions to develop a values-based approach to content acquisition, which sounds very worthy, but then it was immediately tested by what I will call the financial apocalypse that we've experienced at the University of York. And then Kirsty's going to talk a little bit more about some possible futures for scholarly publishing and acquisitions based on some of the experiences that we have been through. So where did this all start then? How did we come to develop our principles? This is something we'd wanted to do for a little while anyway. We'd been exploring it in different ways, different colleagues looking at it, particularly because the University of York strategy is to be a university for public good. That is really kind of filtered through a lot of what the university does. It was the driving ethos of the university when it was first opened, and our current Vice-Chancellor really wanted to bring that back to the forefront of what the university was doing. So developing this approach for our collections was our way of living out what it means to be a university for public good. Important for context that York is a multidisciplinary institution. We have both on-campus and online provision across a very wide range of disciplines. So it's important, of course, that our collections reflect that diversity and that we, in turn, aren't reliant on any one model because we've got to meet all of those different and sometimes conflicting needs. So what we wanted to do then was work with the academic colleagues on our Library and Archives Committee. So that's a group of some library staff, some academic staff from our three faculties who meet semi-regularly, really just as a discussion forum for what the library's doing and how we can work better with our faculty partners. So we wanted to come up with a set of values-based statements which would drive how we think about purchasing and to some extent help us to decide the kinds of things that we might purchase or maybe not. The principles were not intended to be exhaustive. They are principles rather than being hard and fast rules about what we will do. But we wanted to reflect what we felt were the most important ethical concerns related to our purchasing. Now, I'm not going to go through the principles in detail because that would eat up our time quite considerably, but if you do want to have a look at them, I've put on the slide here for you both a QR code and a link, so please do explore those if you'd like to. You can read the principles and you can listen to them in a video form as well, so however you want to engage with those, please do. What I've pulled out here are some of the key terms from those 10 principles, and there's a lot of words there that you would expect to see in something of a values-based approach, and I'll just pick out a couple of them. value as a term was an interesting one. Obviously, a lot of the value offer that we consider with our collections is around the money. You know, are these collections proving to be value for money? But a lot of the conversation we had with our academic colleagues was, how do you measure value in another sense? How can you put a value on the importance of a journal that's used day in, day out by a very small group of people, where the value for money is maybe not so good, but the value of what they're doing is much, much higher? We talked about being a champion for a lot of these issues and championing our own principles within the institution. We talked about the influence that we have as librarians that is often overlooked within our institutions. And actually, we've talked a lot internally about how we bring that to bear, and we've had to in recent times as well. So I'd encourage you, if you're interested, to go and have a look at those principles in a bit more detail, and you'll get a sense for some of what we were trying to do. Moving on then to think about what has happened and whether it was good, bad, and emerging. So the good, we'd wanted to do this for a while, and we were able to. We have, as I'm sure many other people, have had lots of eye-opening examples of poor practice, really exorbitantly expensive resources. And those are the kind of things that generally, I guess, across the profession, we don't necessarily talk to our academic departments about. That's much more of an internal issue. But actually, where we have started to lift the lid, as it were, on some of those practices, we've had some really encouraging and useful conversations with people about how things might look a bit different in the future. So that was the good. That was a really good kind of foundation and starting point for some really useful discussions. But then there was the bad. There was the financial apocalypse. So the University of York had already gone through a period of efficiency saving and voluntary severance. We then received the sort of edict from the university that our operating budget would be cut. The only thing left that we could cut was our collections. And the depth and breadth of our savings, and Kirsty said it's okay for me to say that it was £1 million from our collection budget, which was a quarter of our spend, meant that, of course, we didn't really want to be shouting too loudly about how we were really principled and ethical in our collecting practices, because that seemed a little bit disingenuous with the kinds of outcry that we knew we were going to get from the scale of those kind of cuts. So it did mean that what we would have done in terms of talking to colleagues about this and really building up the picture of these principles was a little bit dampened. But there was some good again in what's emerging as well. So having the set of principles has in itself been a benefit. We've had to negotiate with suppliers and publishers as part of our withdrawal from read and publish agreements. So having those principles there was a really good bedrock for what we wanted to achieve. And we have examples of publishers changing their approach when we've pushed them on those principles. It has, of course, also in really difficult times given us the sense that we're doing the right thing. Because we had those principles before we had to start the process of thinking what we're going to cut, it did give us a really solid baseline for what we wanted to do and how we wanted to do it. So I don't think that any of us felt like it was wasted because we had that really solid foundation. Hopefully we can do more with it in the future when, fingers crossed, the financial apocalypse maybe isn't so prevalent. So it's important to reflect then that principled, pragmatic can feel like very different ends of a scale, but we were very deliberate in calling this talk principled and pragmatic. We didn't want to be making a choice between those things. The question that comes might be, well, you've got those principles, does that mean that there are some things that you just wouldn't buy? And should libraries be getting into those kind of conversations about, is it our place to say we're not going to buy something because it doesn't match with our principles? It's very important to say that we never viewed this as a censorship issue. We are not there to say that is an inappropriate resource, we're not going to purchase it. But what is important is for us to shine a light on some of the poor practices that we are aware of and have those deeper conversations with academics to make them aware of some of those issues. So whilst we would never say we are not going to purchase that thing, it might be very relevant and important to what they're doing, certainly what we would say is, well, if you want us to purchase that thing, these are the issues that you need to be aware of. And if you want us to proceed, well, that's okay, but you're doing that with the due diligence that's happened before that as well. When we move on to pragmatism then, I suppose, in this, is that it's ever more important than it's ever been, for us to be responsible custodians of the corporate budget that our university gives to us. So we have shrinking budgets, we have increased scrutiny in many different ways. We have to be able to demonstrate that we're spending that money very wisely. And of course, for libraries within an institution, it's very rare, or certainly harder, for us to generate any income in the same way that other departments do in our university. So we are spending the money, but we're not able to generate it in quite the same way, or not so directly. But we can show our value in other forms, particularly by fulfilling the strategy of our university, the University for Public Good, and by really being at the forefront of those positive changes of the scholarly publishing landscape. And that is where we felt that being principled meets being pragmatic. And that's also where we're going to hand over our talk.
Right, so thinking a bit more about the future of scholarly publishing in a landscape where we have a set of principles that we want to kind of embed, but we also have to be really pragmatic because of the context that we find ourselves in. So we do find ourselves thinking about a sort of series of questions as we're sort of moving forward and looking at what do we do next. You know, how should we spend our content budget? It's been significantly reduced, but actually we still have a budget and there is still some decisions to be made within that. And I think, again, the sort of current situation does also present us with some interesting opportunities. And it's made me think a lot around about who really needs to understand that sort of scholarly publishing landscape. And it's made me also reflect that over the last sort of period, we've become amazing service providers, and it's seamless, it's easy, it's at the click of the button, it's whenever you want it, and we've actually stopped one of the core communities that we're working with, our academics, thinking a little bit about how all of that happens. And I think that is something we need to do a little bit more around and think a bit more about. But I think also when you're in this situation, you suddenly find yourself doing something where you're acting in order to benefit your institution, and that's very important. We are interested in our institution's longer-term survival, but we also need to think about the wider community and how we purchase. And we've got particular purchasing models, which means that we negotiate collaboratively using JISC, and I think we need to think about what are our roles within that and how do we take that forward? And again, how do we sort of harness our collective power? So that's been a lot of what I've been suddenly thinking about, and I think for those who know me will realise that thinking a lot about content and how I purchase content wasn't something I had done an awful lot, because it just happened, it was easy, and we had enough budget and it just worked. And yes, I was really interested in open access publishing and how we could do more and encourage that. And that again was one of the areas we wanted our principals to engage with. But suddenly it sort of takes on a completely different light and you're having to think about it in a really, really different context. So I think these were some of the things we've sort of been thinking about. You know, it's not just us, it's a sort of wider sectoral thing. But we do need to think about what that means for each of us and the actions each of us takes individually for our institutions and then for that wider community. And I think, you know, that building back better, building back something differently, thinking around about new models is something that we need to do, but we need to do collectively in collaboration, in partnership. And I think it's a partnership that, you know, is around about libraries working together, but it's about working with our academic communities, it's about working with our institutions. But I think the one thing we can do is really help have that conversation in the institution. And I think one of the things that has happened at York is we've had an incredible conversation about scholarly publishing, what we want out of scholarly publishing, and understanding and hearing from our academics what they want from scholarly publishing and where that might take us in the future. And that is quite a mixed picture. It is a picture that is a varied landscape. And yes, our academics do want those prestige publications, and we might all have different views about that. But we also have academics who really want open access models, and they want to do things differently. So I think our role at this current point in time is to think about How can we have that conversation and bring something to the forelight when we've made it so seamless that it feels like we don't need to talk about it? And I think that is one of the challenges we need to come away with from today. And it's about building back in different ways. And it's about thinking about those different models, because again, what I've really become aware of, and as we were talking yesterday in the ethical procurement panel, yes, we are very much dealing with things where we're talking to monopolies. There aren't multiple places where you can go to do this. So how do we then deal with that? But how do we also build different models that help us move forward if we're not happy with the ones we've got? But also, where do we sit within that sort of broader piece? And how can we support that? And we do have some power. We do have our content budget. We can help people make some decisions about that, even if it's just a small amount, even if it is just £5,000–10,000 that go towards something. We don't want to be looking around and having a market where we have even less choice than we currently have. And I think that sort of changing conversation, I think a really sort of key part of this has been looking at those different models and suddenly shining a light on them to our institution, but also then starting to have conversations with our academics about, well, how does open access publishing sit within that kind of academic culture, and what does that mean for promotions criteria? How can we influence that? Can that be something that's actually mentioned? So we are now having a conversation about how can we make open access publishing part of the guidelines in the academic promotions criteria? How can we weave in, if someone, puts effort into writing an open educational textbook that's then used in the institution, how can that be part of the promotions criteria? I think York's unusual. We have professors who are there for their teaching qualifications as well as academics who are there for their research qualifications. So starting to weave this so that they value it, they see why they should engage and how those different models can support them and be part of that. Because I think without starting to shift this as a whole community endeavour, we're not going to manage to get to some of those things. And it is very much that influencing and using those different networks. We find a lot of our young academics are really keen to engage with this, and it's how do we help build that voice for them? How do we enable them to talk about it and begin to provide those case studies, especially when we have some really, really highly respected academics who, unless it's a particular journal, you're never going to move onward, you're never going to have a career. And I think it is, again, about acknowledging they see their careers not just in our institutions, but in their disciplines across a range of institutions. So again, how can we support some of that and have that driver for those things? So is the future bright? Is there cause for optimism? I think if we think and are thoughtful about this and are thoughtful around about what we do with our library budgets, even in times where we have a lot less to spend, and yes, ours has reduced significantly, but it's still quite a significant budget within all of what we spend. We can do things with that. I think I've had a very vibrant conversation and sometimes a very challenging conversation with the academics at York, but also a very positive conversation with them as they've suddenly begun to understand what changing our sort of landscape has meant to them. And they've suddenly begun to realise that actually this seamless, I just click, it appears, has come at a cost. But we've made it really easy. So when we then presented with some figures and said, yes, you've asked us to make this reduction, yes, we can make it, they didn't quite appreciate what that experience was going to be like for them, what it was going to feel like for them, what they suddenly could and couldn't do, what they'd taken for granted, and also what they had stopped appreciating actually costs a lot of money and does need some investment, And I had a sort of dean say to me, why don't you work collaboratively to negotiate, maybe in a sort of consortium or something? And I was sort of going, yes, well, actually, that's exactly what we do. We work with JISC, we work with over, so many hundreds of institutions, to negotiate. And he went, but it's so expensive. And he'd stopped seeing that because it's just there. When he goes to the library, when he looks at our catalogues, or when he's online and is looking for something, we've enabled ways that if we've purchased the content, our academics can get access to it. We've made it almost too easy. They've stopped remembering all those different steps in between that used to happen, and they've therefore also just forgotten what our role is and how we help them and how we are part of that kind of research endeavour as well. So I think it's very much shining a light on that, highlighting that, and getting that academic support and understanding what is our role in research when we're in a sort of ethical procurement situation. So is the future bright? Well, I think we're very much trying to balance things. We've had a really good conversation, and for York, the outcome has been that I will be going back to our University Executive Board with another paper to present once the new next generation deals have been concluded. We're going to have a further conversation about what the future of our library collections looks like, and we're going to do more information gathering and evaluation of where we are currently, what that means for our researchers, and also what do our researchers want, in order to then look at how we go forward and what it is we actually would like our library collections to be and where we're going next. So I think there's cause for optimism. There's cause for optimism because actually we've gotten there, and I think that try stopping us comes very much from the team at York. They've been absolutely incredible in reimagining every single workflow possible and doing it all differently, and kind of helping us work through everything, and the team have engaged really actively with our academic community. We've raised awareness on a whole host of things and have sort of changed how the university and in particular research academics view the library, and we'll see where that takes us next. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much to David and Kirsty. I really loved the kind of, putting that sort of principles bedrock, and then, actually the David noting authenticity, I really loved as well. And then that wonderful idea of introducing friction into a hitherto seamless sort of system to provoke discussion. So please, note your questions, sit on your hands for now, because we're going straight into our second presentation, which is Reflecting Library Values in the Shift from Procurement to Investment by Joanna Ball, who is the Managing Director at the Directory of Open Access Journals, where she's been for 3 years, and much of her focus has been on long-term sustainability. She's going to share her experiences of values-aligned investment in open access from both her previous experience in libraries in the UK and Denmark, and from the perspective of an open infrastructure.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here and see so many people still here and engaged this afternoon. So I'm going to continue the conversation that we've been having around library values and principles, and really drill down into how that impacts decisions around investment in open. And when I talk about investment in open, I mean investment in open content, open services, and open infrastructure. And I'm going to start with my very own model of the evolution of library procurement. You won't find this in a textbook. It hasn't been endorsed in any way by JISC, but it's really looking at the journey that we have taken within library procurement over the last few decades, moving from print to digital, from purchasing to license, through to managing transformative agreements. And every time we have gone through one of those shifts, libraries have had to reevaluate what their content means, what their role is in relation to that content, and what their overall role is. And I would, of course, argue that investing is perhaps the most advanced form of library procurement, but requires another shift in the way we think about what libraries are and how they work. So what's different about an investment rather than the transactional model that we're all used to within libraries? Well, investments tend to be longer term. You're paying into something now because you want to see a return in the future. They also tend to be much more collaborative. And the benefits will be felt not only by the person making or doing the transaction, but also by the wider community. And very quickly, you'll see that we come onto values as soon as we start talking about investments. So you're seeing words like trust, mutual growth, and sustainability. My colour coordination is not quite as bright as yours, but we do orange at DOAJ. So, and I speak to libraries from across Europe, in North America, and in other parts of the world, to make a case for them to invest in my service. And I'm hearing from them that they are increasingly using values to support decisions on investment and partnership. But of course, we can't use the traditional frameworks and metrics that we've always used for the transactional models of library procurement, so we need to try something different. Values on their own can't drive decisions. We need to translate those values into principles. I'm sure lots of people in this room have already done a lot of work around the values of their own organisation, and will know that values are core beliefs that guide what an organisation considers important. They might shape our attitudes, but that we need to translate them into kind of concrete rules or guidelines that provide a structured way for us to make decisions. And we saw a great example from the University of York just now. These are library values, or some of the values that we share as libraries, and how we can begin to translate them into principles when we think about partnering and investing in open services or open infrastructure. So the value of trust is really important to us as a profession. It's in the title of this conference. So if you're looking to invest in an organisation, and you want to use trust as a value, then you might be looking for financial transparency. You want to see that organisation is going to be there tomorrow. You want to make sure that it has a legal setup, which means that it can't be bought or sold. In terms of sustainability, you want to make sure that the organisation you're investing in has sustainable financial models and is using its resources really carefully. Community, and that sense of community-led and community governance, is becoming more and more important within the academic sector. So if you are making decisions based on that value, you want to see that there is real evidence of stakeholder governance and that the service is developing in line with the needs of the community. Open, again, another one of our core values. So open metadata, open source, open standards. And why do we want to see those things? Because we want to make sure that what we're investing in can be taken and reused elsewhere within the ecosystem, and even more value can be generated from it. And finally, inclusivity, and actually as part of the ethical procurement session I was in yesterday, we had a conversation of how equitable procurement was really important to libraries. So if that's a concern, then you want to use principles around making sure that what you're investing in includes stakeholders from a diverse range of backgrounds. So libraries love a framework. We've seen that the principles that York are using, other individual libraries are setting up their own rubrics and frameworks around how to make decisions about investment in open. And I can really recommend the University of Florida, which has a good one if you want to look at that. But I just want to highlight three three frameworks that are very strong in the community at the moment. The first one is a real grassroots initiative from the US. Two librarians in the US have put together the Library Partnership Rating. Librarians actually use a rubric and evaluate publishers themselves and publish the results. And it covers a range of different principles and values based around transparency, based on whether a publisher is collaborative and cooperative. Susan Haig yesterday mentioned SCOSS, the Global Sustainability Coalition for Open Science Services. I'm so glad I remembered that acronym. That's always a hard one. That's been around and for a while now. There were actually a total of 14 infrastructures funded as part of the SCOSS initiative over 6 funding cycles. For an infrastructure to be considered as a SCOSS infrastructure, they need to apply and demonstrate how they may meet a range of eligibility criteria, including the fact that they're mission-driven and that they engage actively with their community. And libraries actually all around the world are using SCOSS as a framework to make decisions around investment in open infrastructure. And finally, a shout out to our colleagues at GISC Collections for their open access community framework, which supports libraries' investments in open content. Again, there's a list of criteria for an organisation to be eligible to be part of that framework, and that includes community governance and financial transparency. But I also promised to talk about this from the infrastructure perspective, and that's something that's very, very close to my heart. I'm going to very briefly mention my organisation, in case you're not familiar with us. We are the Directory of Open Access Journals, so we have 21,000 journals within the index now. Every journal that is in the index has had to go through a very rigorous process against our evaluation criteria. And to support that process, I have a team of 25 members who are spread all over the world conducting those evaluations. We're an organisation currently set up in the UK as a community interest company, and we're non-profit. So this is why investment is something that is so important to me, and that's because we rely almost entirely on community investment. We're involved with a couple of Horizon Europe projects, but otherwise that's where all our income comes from. And actually that £1 million figure you had earlier from York would probably just about cover what I need to run my service. But I wanted to show these figures to you, really to demonstrate just how strong that support from libraries is. So 3/4 of the investment that comes in from the community comes from libraries, from institutions, from funders, so all public bodies. And those libraries are investing in DOAJ through contributions, usually of around 2,000 or 4,000 euros each, so not huge amounts of money. Sometimes they're contributing individually, but very often they are contributing through consortial arrangements. So, for example, we have an agreement with GISC Collections here in the UK. So it's really important for me, in order to be able to sustain my service, to make sure that I am meeting, of course, the values of my own organisation, but that I'm also aligning with your values, our values, and that I can demonstrate that we are a good source, a good place for you to invest your money. And we do that in a number of ways, and I'm going to talk about some of these frameworks that we use as infrastructures. And it could be me standing here today, it could be my colleague who's here from OAPEN, it could be any number of open infrastructures who are using the same kind of tools. So I want to talk about the principles of open scholarly infrastructure to start with. These were established in 2015 by Cameron Nayland, Jeffrey Bilder and Jennifer Lynn, because they were concerned about the number of open scholarly infrastructures that were being bought up and essentially enclosed by commercial companies. There's a set now of principles which you can go and have a look at online, and they cover everything from transparent stakeholder governance, sustainability and insurance. So things like, are you involving the community in the running of your organisation? Is your revenue generation mission aligned? Are you generating a surplus? Do you have financial reserves? And for insurance, is your service reproducible? So if DOAJ fell down tomorrow and my entire team disappeared, could the community take our metadata and our software and recreate that service? And the answer is they could. So POSI is managed and developed by the community of adopters now. And there are currently 22 of those, including a really wide range of organisations, Crossref, OAPEN, R Research, who are the organisation behind OpenAlex, and PKP, behind OJS, are just some of them. So DOAJ adopted POSI back in 2022. When I say we adopted it, that meant we spent some time discussing how we met each of the criteria internally. We went out and had that discussion with our board and our council, and then we published the results of that evaluation online. And you can see all of the different evaluations from the POSI adopters online. We're currently re-evaluating our service against these principles. And I want to just really talk about how it's had an impact on our work, how we use these frameworks to actually bring about change. One of the things that we have done is to change the way that the organisation is governed and actually change our entire legal structure to make it more accountable to the community. So we now have a small foundation board who I report to, and actually very importantly can fire me if I'm not doing my job properly. So there is real accountability there. And we also made moves to include a wider range of stakeholders. So previously we had prioritised governance involvement from organisations that were able to support us financially. But in terms of equity, that's really not fair, because our service is relied upon by libraries, by researchers around the world. So we're opening up for everybody to be able to participate. Another principle within POSI that's been very important for us was the idea that our metadata belongs to the community. It doesn't belong to us. And that if we're going to generate revenue, that should be based on services, not on our metadata. So we conducted a sustainability review a couple of years ago with research consulting to look at how we could make our organisation more sustainable, and very quickly ruled out the idea that we would be able to package up and sell our metadata. We focused instead on thinking about how we could develop premium services around that metadata. And then finally, the requirement to have adequate financial reserves. It was quite clear that we needed to focus a little bit more on building up adequate financial reserves for the organisation to improve our sustainability and resilience. The second framework I want to highlight to you, and if you haven't heard about this, I would really recommend that you go away and have a look at it. It's a Forest framework for values-driven scholarly communication, which was an output from the Next Generation Libraries project. It's all available openly online for reuse. And that can be used by scholarly communications organisations like mine, or actually libraries as well, to really think about how they are meeting a set of values, evaluating that and thinking about how they can improve their alignment with those values. Forest is an acronym. I won't read out the list of values that it stands for, but they're very familiar when you consider the list that I was talking about earlier. DOAJ was part of a pilot project around the Forest framework with a number of other open infrastructures, and it was a really useful exercise for us. I'm just showing one of the slides from the framework here, and just the powerful questions that it's encouraging you to answer. And it's a really useful exercise for us to carry out as a team, to think about actually how transparent are we as a service. So we carried out the pilot, and it enabled us to reflect not only, of course, on where we could do better, but also on where we're doing well, and where we are following best practice. For example, we've always been really good at declaring conflict of interest across our team, across our board, and across our volunteers. We also revisited our internal policy around transparency, around our editorial process. So how much do we share about the process? Do we share when a journal has applied to DOAJ and been rejected? Do we share when a journal has applied to DOAJ and been excluded for potentially predatory practices? We also published our publisher supporter model for the first time. We've always had an openly available library supporter model, but this was the first time we decided to make our publisher supporter model openly available. And we also shared our development roadmap with the community. The final framework I want to share with you is IntraFinder from Invest in Open. This service was launched last year. And it's really a service for you, not for me. It's been developed as a trusted source of information about infrastructures to enable you to make decisions about what organisations you want to work with or what organisations you want to invest in. And it enables you to compare information across over 100 different infrastructures. For us, applying to be part of InfraFinder was a good process to go through. It enabled us to think about openness, trust, transparency again. It also enables us to do a quick comparison against best practice with other open infrastructures and make sure that we are doing as well as we can. And for example, we made some changes to our code of conduct as a result of that exercise. So I just wanted to finish with a couple of words, provocations about the future of values and library investments in open. Kirsty talked about power not long ago, and I really think that libraries do have the values and the budgets, even if they're being reduced, and the power to bring about change within scholarly publishing. And I think if we just look at the recent ebook model saga that's gone on and the impact that libraries have been able to have, especially through collective action and working together, that's quite something. The evaluation frameworks that I've been talking about provide rigour and protect the investments that are aligned with value. So when we have to start cutting, we hold on to what's important. And I'd also say that the values aren't just something to be kind of flaunted or flexed when the going is good. They also need to be there and upheld when things get tough. And I really believe that this current difficult time that we find ourselves in is an opportunity for libraries to put their money where their values are. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Joanna. DOAJ is one of the cornerstones of the open infrastructure that we all rely on so much, so it's really great to hear how values are informing their work. So we have a nice chunk of time due to the discipline of our panel for questions, and I can see one right in front of me here. So William is on his way.
Thank you, William. Jim's Anthony Edwards, University of Exeter. So not-for-profit, community-led, focused on, what is needed in the sector, publishing organisations are a good thing. So the American Chemical Society tells me. How do we influence the publishers and the organisations? So Kirsty, you talked about influencing internally. Joanna, you kind of started getting to this in your last slide, but I'm just really interested to hear more about how, not just when we come to a negotiation, but as an ongoing partnership, how do we build a partnership? How do you influence without just hitting up every 3 years at renewal cycle?
Oh, looks like it's me then, as everyone looks sideways. Okay, I think it's really, really hard, actually. And I think and I don't think we would have had some of the conversations we have had if we hadn't put grit in the system and suddenly also made everyone go, oh, it's slightly different than it was before. Oh, what's happened? And have that sort of realization. So I think it is really hard because it's all happens so easily. You don't see it and it's just there. And I think you're right, with the American Chemistry Society, that is a really difficult one. They are some of those things that you noted, and they are some of the things which we note from a sort of values perspective, where, yes, there is transparency, but actually we see, there's areas in activity where we think, well, that doesn't quite fully align. But actually, when we talk to our chemists, for some of them that does align, and for some of the chemists it doesn't align. So I think it's that mixed community piece. It's trying to understand the broader community, trying to sort of influence and having that dialogue there through the academics we do come into contact with daily, and perhaps help shape their thinking to help then shape the thinking of their society. So something our sort of keynote speaker said this morning of kind of activating for change within an institution, within a framework. I think it's looking at those ways in and then sort of shaping those different frameworks in order to perhaps engender change, but that takes time and we are sometimes impatient.
I'm just going to take Chair's privilege to just follow on from James's question. And going back to our first day, and the reply that one of our keynote speakers gave to a question put from the audience around, the relationships between commercial publishers and libraries and universities, and how the gap between us and them is like this, and the gap between us and them together and hostile actors is like this. So actually kind of backing up James's point that we need to work, well, that was certainly the view of the speaker. So yeah,
But I think that's what it's about working with them and with our academics to then go and look at, well, what are the bits we can compromise and come to an agreement on that makes us all feel happier, and that is from working perhaps within the system rather than attacking it from out with, because actually they are probably closer in value than some other agents, as you've just sort of highlighted.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just to add to that as well, quickly,
David, go ahead.
I guess as well it's the power of that collective purchasing that we have. If we're talking just us as University of York, well, it's very easy for a publisher to dismiss that and say, well, that's just your university that's in that position, but we know that's not the case across the sector. And we experienced, I think it's fair to say, Kirsty, quite a lot of disbelief, did we not, when we started talking to publishers about this? They didn't believe the depth of cut that we had to make, but I think they will start to be more aware of that, as obviously we're not the only university who'll be talking to them about it. And clearly it's harder with some publishers than others, but we have had some success in negotiating where it would have previously been, for example, a 3-year deal and that was it. You have it for 3 years. We have been able to negotiate, for example, annual opt-out clauses. So that does give us that opportunity to go back from our perspective to say this is not working, rather than it purely being on their timescale as well.
Thank you. I've got a self-running panel here.
Joanna,
go ahead.
I just have to say, I just want to come back on which was a very good point about community-led, because there is so much community washing at the moment, and community-led is a scale, and it can be from being really accountable to your community to having a bit of involvement of the community in the way you're run. And if your primary motivation is to generate profit, even if it's for your society, then that's something that's different, I would say, than a true community-governed organisation. So I think there's distinctions to be made there.
Yeah, I love that term, community washing. So I think we've got a question here.
Thank you, Masood Khokhar, University of Leeds. Primarily for Kirsty and David. I'm thinking about values, and it's building on the value discussion that you're just having. And the fact that our values are not always aligned with what academics see as values. They're really keen on streamlined access, easy publishing, all that kind of stuff. and also sometimes their own societies that they really want to develop further. So 2 questions. If there was no financial pressure, do you think you would have been as successful still in convincing them to move on? And I think, firstly, I must also congratulate you on what you've achieved. It's been a great, great thing for the sector to really learn from you and benefit from that wisdom. So that's one parter. And also, would it have just delayed that and still achieved the same outcome? Or it could have been that in some places I've heard that they're trying to directly negotiate with publishers and basically eroding the role of the library in that way. And then the second question is a more broader one about ethical procurement, which is, are we also looking at climate in some of these conversations? Are we looking at other elements other than just the values that we have as from a procurement perspective? Just a broad conversation.
I can pick up the first question, I think, soon. As to whether this aligns with academic viewpoints on what we should be doing, I think the picture is mixed. I think there are some who absolutely do see what we're doing as important, and others who, as Kirsty was talking about, it's very much the same model has worked for us for a long time. We don't want to upset that model. I've been accused more than once when I've talked to academics as part of this process of being some kind of moral crusader or an open access zealot because of wanting to change things. And I've had to turn around and say, well, it's not that at all. We can't pay our invoices if we don't have the money from our university. So I think it has sped up that process of change that we would have seen at our university. I think some academics have made an assumption that it's happened because we have that viewpoint about the move to open access. We had a webinar session not that long ago where somebody said, well, don't you think that people would have kind of taken this better had you told them that you were investing in open access instead? So I'm sure they would, but that's not what happened. If only we could have invested the money more in open access, that money was gone. So I think for some academics, that move to open access is a real boon, and they have supported that. I think for others, that's where the friction points have been, and it's been much more challenging to convince them. And in some ways, it's not our role to convince them. Obviously, we've been left to pick up the communication piece around budget cuts and why this had to happen and why cut this and why not cut that. But ultimately, actually, that's a university responsibility around our open access policies and bringing departments along with that. We have an important role to play, but I suppose the buck doesn't stop only with the library service.
And I think, had this not happened, we'd hope to sort of start shifting, where we spend our kind of library budget in kind of different areas. And it would have been a slower journey, but it would have been hopefully a more thoughtful journey, and one where we could have perhaps gauged academics at different points and taken them along with us. Whereas I think we've ended up with, at some points in some departments, sort of slightly polar opposite views. But again, that has shifted and had led to sort of some significant conversations. So I would say it's not been easy, but I think it's been really valuable. And I think, again, we all have a much better understanding of that piece. Remind me what the second part
was. It was the environmental.
The environmental bit. I think, again, we'd sort of built and started thinking around about that. We're going to start thinking about, having got principles together, how could we then look at how we evaluate and look at those particular factors. And I have to say, that's not been where our thinking has been, particularly at the moment, because we've had to do such a huge shift. And I think that's something we hope to come back to. It's something we're doing in other areas and have done quite a bit of work on that, but I think needs to kind of come back to it. We just haven't quite had that same time to do that.
Yep. Just here. I'm letting people name themselves.
Thanks very much. Joe Marshall, National Library of Scotland. Thanks all of you, really great papers. Who knew that procurement was so interesting? This particular question for David and Kirsty. So you had a really nice phrase about shining a light on poor practice. And I mean, obviously we see a range of behaviours from publishers. I wonder if you could say a bit more about what you think the red lines should be.
Oh gosh, I thought you were going to ask me to name and shame there.
No.
No, I won't do that. We're being recorded, Some of the engagement we saw was thinking back to a thread on X that one of my colleagues, or was it Twitter at the time, I don't know, where essentially we started to give some of the examples of the kind of prices that we're getting from some publishers, where, you know, it might be a print copy of a book would cost you £20, but the ebook for an unlimited access would cost you 10 grand or something. And that's, I'm remembering off the top of my head, that's not a real example, but it's not far off the real examples that we do see. So I suppose for me, it's that kind of a red line where you can see the inequity across those different forms, and also where a publisher is maybe trying to establish a model online or electronically that has never existed previously. So a good example of this is with e-textbooks, where, of course, in the past, where those weren't available electronically, the library would be buying a reasonable number of textbooks to fulfill the needs of our student cohorts. Certainly, we would not have been buying one per student. You know, some institutions may do that, but that's often not what the library would be doing. But an e-textbook model is built all around one textbook for one student, and you have to scale up the numbers. So we're seeing the emergence of a model electronically that never would have existed in a print world. And I suppose from the publisher's point of view, they may say, well, you know, your students were buying their own copies. I don't see that happening. And in fact, most academic departments now have to declare to students if there's any expectation that they have to buy something as part of their course. And as you can imagine, they are not telling students that you need to buy textbooks, because that's the role of the university library. So I would say that one of those red lines should be those kind of emerging practices that are possible in a digital landscape that weren't actually ever a thing previously, and then we need to be very mindful of those approaches that really don't sit with our practices.
Is there anything, I know the question was specifically for David and Kirsty, but is there anything you'd like to add from your perspective, Joanna?
No, but can I ask a question?
Please do.
I just wanted
You
to
get
ask,
the last one.
because you also mentioned predatory practices, and I was interested what you meant by predatory, because that's quite a strong term. So I'm just interested in...
We have had sort of instances where we've been contacted by publishers where they've demonstrated the resources are being used by our kind of academic community, which we haven't bought or purchased licenses for. And that's because of a range of different factors, and sometimes it's around about they've maybe come to it for a different route because of their discipline or something. There's been a free and then they've kind of landed into a paid for, and then the publisher basically threatens to take us to court unless we pay certain charges. And they can often be quite considerable. So again, we've started, you know, we will highlight back, and we will sort of maybe, you know, get in touch with JISC and sort of other agencies and bodies. We'll sort of sometimes have a bit of a, you know, talk to other people. I know quite often we're sort of advised not to speak to anyone about it, but it quite often emerges that that's something that's happening to a number of people at the same time. We then sort of also talk to our legal teams and sort of take advice and guidance, but also highlight to our academics what's happening there, and it's about, you know, their behaviours, what they need to think about, but then also sort of try and sort of shine a bit of a light on it, that that's not acceptable practice. So we're finding there's a range of these behaviours, and we're seeing more and more, and I am sort of encouraging the teams to have those kind of polite conversations back with different people to kind of highlight what our viewpoint is and why it's not okay. That has some interesting reactions sometimes, but I mean the teams are really fantastic, but I think it is important that we do, you know, shine a light on that, and it's also sometimes about highlighting to academics, because they're completely unaware that that's happening, because quite often we just deal with it quietly in the background, and then they sort of sometimes stumble and see something again. But we're seeing a real mix, which is why that was one of the things we did want to start picking up on in a sort of appropriate way.
Yeah. And just quickly to add to that the example Kirsty's talking about, which again I won't name, but I'm sure some of you will guess, essentially was a complicated one around licensing. So the licensing for different groups was handled by either non-commercial or commercial entities, and the licensing from a university point of view for that product sat with a commercial publisher. And they, when they first got in touch with us, said, well, you know, you've been using this for a long time. We haven't. So what you should do is, you know, pay us for all the years that you weren't paying us, but because we're so nice, we're going to get rid of that, and you can just pay for this year onwards. No, that's very generous of you. We're not paying you anything because we don't use it at all. But another example, I think, would be where you receive a communication about something completely not related to publishing, which somehow just becomes about that. So we very often, for example, get people reaching out about the very high quality of your subject guides online, and I was really impressed by just how amazing they are. Oh, thank you very much. That's very good. Oh, by the way, actually, would you mind just adding a link to this for me, or would you be interested in hearing more about X? So that kind of disingenuous introduction as well, the real lack of transparency that actually, if you wanted to sell me something, you could have just said that, and I probably would have been more interested. So I think that's sort of practice.
We've got time for one more question, and I know Mel has one down over on this side of the room.
Thank you. My name's Lucy Veasley from the University of Nottingham. My question's for Joanna, actually. I was really interested to hear about the different frameworks, and particularly the POSSE framework you showed, and how that made you think about the revenue based on services rather than data and not selling metadata. And you mentioned about developing premium services around that metadata. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about what those services are that you have in mind.
Yeah, of course. So the services we are thinking about aren't really targeted at libraries. Actually, we have, libraries are stepping up and contributing and supporting our work and investing in us. It's really to enable us to or enable the aggregators and data users that are taking our data for free, selling it on as part of their services and making a profit on it. It's enabling them to be able to support us. So if we can provide them with, or encourage them to pay for perhaps a more up-to-date version of our API or our OAI PMH feed, or whatever that might be, then that means that they are also contributing to our sustainability. Because it's just not fair, or I don't think it's fair, that libraries are using money from their budgets to support our work, but that there are commercial companies taking our work and making money out of it and not contributing back to us. So that's the kind of thing I was talking about.